We at Speaking Schools Australasia, we focus on public speaking and debating education. And back when I was a university student, I was coaching debating at quite a wealthy school on Sydney's North Shore. Now, most competitions that this school competed in were with other wealthy schools, people who were quite blessed, quite privileged, but not all of them. And there was this one particular training session that I had with the students. The debating round that week was on education, and we were up against a school that didn't come from the same privileged background as a number of the students in my group. Now, we could have spent time in that training session discussing the ideas and the arguments that would likely come up in the types of topics that you often see in education rounds. But after a little bit of an initial discussion with the students, it became very clear that that wasn't the best use of our time. Now, the students all meant well, they all had decent ideas, they all grappled with the concepts that we wanted to teach, but they just expressed them very, very poorly. Now, because we were up against a school from a lower socioeconomic background, this type of stuff just wouldn't fly and was realistically, for a number of the students on the other side, would have probably come across as borderline offensive for them. So rather than talking about the ideas and arguments, we spent the lesson instead discussing how to best phrase the ideas they already had without coming across as being offensive or meaning to harm or insult people from those backgrounds. So, for example, we discussed in quite a lot of depth that you can't just assume that all students from these other schools from a lower socioeconomic background, all these students were necessarily less able. And there were lots of reasons for that. Firstly, it's not necessarily true. Secondly, it's way better phrased as a discussion about the opportunities that those students have compared to the opportunities students have from more privileged schools. But also, thirdly, it implied personal attack, saying that innately the students on the other side of the debate were less able. So this experience, for me at least, reiterated three very important things. The first one is that kids are actually naturally quite empathetic. The students meant well. When they said that students from lower privileged areas were less able, it's not because they thought they were worse. It's that they wanted to help them improve and wanted them to have a better quality of life. Naturally, they were empathetic. Naturally, they wanted others to have a better life. The second thing it reiterated for me was that context and culture has a humongous impact on how empathy is expressed by students and children. But thirdly, it also reiterated for me the interaction with debating, and particularly debating with people from a different walk of life, and just how big an impact this can have on students and how they develop their empathetic skills. So, my name, as I've already been introduced, is Mark Slaven. I've been teaching debating and public speaking for over a decade, and I'm managing director of an organisation based in Sydney called Speaking Schools Australasia. And we teach debating and public speaking to students all over the country, but also all over the world as well, particularly this year as more people have moved to online classes. Yesterday, a number of you guys would have heard from my colleague, Chris. Now, Chris has a much stronger background in public speaking. She talked a lot about audience engagement, the role of storytelling and role-playing, critical thinking and broadening horizons, and focused on these types of public speaking skills to help foster empathy within a classroom. My background is much more debating, and so I'm going to be talking today a lot more about how you can use debating in a classroom environment in order to create and foster empathy and help students develop into more empathic individuals. The way I'll be doing that is I'll be focusing on how debating impacts the three main stakeholders in any debate. You and your team is the first one. The second one is the opposing team in the debate. And the third person is the adjudicator, the person who is judging the debate. Now, before I kind of go on to those three, just so everyone understands the way that debating works, just in case anyone isn't quite across debating as a concept. In Australia, we use a variation of the World Schools Debating Championship format. That is two teams with three individuals, where the first affirmative speaks, the first negative speaks, the second affirmative speaks, the second negative speaks, third affirmative speaks, and finally the third negative speaks. Everyone has an uninterrupted period of time that they are able to get up and present their argument, but importantly, debates are won and lost as teams. The individual component does not matter anywhere near as much as the team component. So, I'm also, as I go through, going to explain how it helps, but also hopefully provide some activities that teachers are able to use in classrooms to help create, to help get the effect of the debate or debating in an individual isolated classroom environment where doing a full debate is not actually an available option. So let's go on to the first idea, your team. Now I'm going to separate this into two different areas. In a debate, you have to prepare with your teammates beforehand. This is usually done in a time-sensitive manner, usually about an hour before the debate. And then you also have to present your argument as a team in the structure that I explained there. So, how does preparation and preparing for a debate foster empathy? Really importantly, it requires effective communication. You have to be able to communicate with the other individuals on your team on a personal level. You're in a pressure cooker here. You're in a pressure cooker where there is limited time. There is high levels of stress because not just one, but everyone in that room is about to get up and present a speech to an audience. And public speaking at the best of times is quite stressful for most people, even people who are kind of really into it as an idea. What this means is it means that stress levels are running really high and people are a little bit on edge. In those circumstances, you need to be incredibly conscious of not only your own feelings and how you're going at that point in time, but how other people in the room are feeling at that time as well. Everyone in that room needs to feel like they can express their own ideas without being shut down. Everyone needs to understand the team's case and be on board with the team's case. By practicing debating and practicing these intense preparation sessions almost weekly for a lot of the people who are doing the competitions, it gets you comfortable in this environment where you actually have to communicate effectively, but also be receptive to how other people are feeling in that environment. Now, in terms of a practical way that you can do this in a classroom outside of a debate, this can be done with a number of different team activities, especially ones that involve a presentation element afterwards. Just getting students to go into teams of 2 or 3 or 4 and then preparing a presentation. The presentation can be on anything in a limited time period, forces them to communicate with others within their team, forces them to really try and understand what other people are thinking. And if they get up and it goes badly, and it goes badly because they didn't listen to others within their team, or it goes badly because they weren't conscious of others' emotions, it's a great learning experience and mistake. But also, if you repeat it a few times over the course of a few weeks or a few months, students begin to learn and students become a lot better at actually empathizing with other people within that high pressure environment. The second way that it helps with your team is when you're up there presenting as a team. As I said before, teams in debating win and lose as a team. An individual's presentation means nothing if they are not working as a team to persuade the adjudicator of their side of the topic. So what's really important in this is two things. Firstly, you need to be able to learn how to trust the other people within your team, to trust that they are going to present the case in the best possible way, to trust that everyone is on board with the arguments that you all agree, because you don't have time to listen. You're writing your own speech. You're writing down rebuttals for the opposing side. You don't have time to listen to your own team member's speech. So it teaches trust, the idea that you need to be able to trust that your teammate is doing the right thing. But the second thing it also strongly encourages is sharing. You win and you lose as a team. You shouldn't hoard the best arguments or the best rebuttals to yourself. If you do that, you might bring them up at the wrong point in the debate, or someone isn't listening to your speech because they're doing other things and they don't know that you've raised it and they can't reinforce it later on. It encourages sharing of ideas. So the people who are speaking first have the best opportunity to bring it up, and you should share your arguments and rebuttal with other individuals in the debate. It leads to a selflessness that is hard to teach because you win or you lose as a team. The way you can do this in an isolated way without using a debate is an activity called alternating stories, where you get, it can be the whole class if you want in a circle, or it could just be 2 or 3 people at the front of the room, and they have to give one line from a story, and then the next person gives another line from the story, and the next person gives another line from the story. By having them spend 5 minutes preparing the vague direction of the story beforehand, you teach them to work as a team in a pressure cooker situation. You get them to share ideas and become comfortable with that, and you get them to trust each other and trust that they're going to say the right things when you get up there. And so that is how debating using teamwork activities can really foster a whole lot of empathy and really help students understand one another, communicate well in pressured situations, but also learn how to trust and share with one another, all things which lead to more empathetic individuals. So, moving on to the second idea, the second big stakeholder in a debate, and that is the opposing team. Really important in a debate is the concept, and I think we've heard this in one of the talks earlier today, about separating the argument or the issue or the rebuttal from the individual who said it. In debating, in the rules of debating, personal attacks on other individuals are clearly outside the rules. You are not allowed to do it, and you are punished by the adjudicator for doing so. You can't just get up and say, the second negative speaker, adjudicator, they were a bit of an idiot. It's not allowed within the debate. Instead, you need to be able to learn how to separate the ideas that the second negative speaker spoke about from the individual who said them. This is difficult. It is something that comes with time and practice, but it is an excellent way of learning how to do it. The second way that dealing with an opposing team can help teach empathy within a debating context is the idea that simply being dismissive of an idea doesn't actually work and doesn't win you debates. Debates are won by comparing the ideas that are raised and the adjudicator deciding which of those had more weight, which team was comparatively better to the one on the other side. You can't just get up and say, Mr. Speaker, the second affirmative's point was just wrong. That doesn't fly in a debate. Instead, you need to engage with it. And the best way to engage with a point and the most persuasive way to engage with a point in a debate is not only to just take exactly what they said, but to look at that argument in its best light that has been raised by someone else and really consider it. Really consider where they're coming from, really consider what they're trying to prove, and then from that position, taking the argument at its best, then going through and dismantling that point or that argument in a way that is much more persuasive, in a way that means that that point no longer carries the same weight in the debate that it otherwise would have. And so by teaching individuals that they can't just be dismissive of others, they need to actually engage with them, take what they say at its best. That requires looking into an individual's motivations, looking into what an individual wants to achieve, and actually empathizing with what that person was trying to do before you are able to actually deal with that argument in a proper way. So there are 2 activities that we often use to help with both of these ideas. The first one of these is one that Chris actually spoke about a bit yesterday, and that's called rebuttal tennis. In rebuttal tennis, what you do is you have either 2 individuals at the front of the room, or you can also split the class into 2. It also works in virtual classrooms, which a lot of people are doing at the moment, where you can just divide the entire Zoom classroom or the Blackboard classroom into 2 individuals and just get people to change their names so everyone knows which side someone is on. What you then do is you set everyone one side of the room as affirmative, one side of the room as negative. You give the whole room the same topic, and you give the affirmative team 60 seconds to kind of discuss, come up with ideas about what they're going to propose. They propose an idea or an argument. The negative team then has 15 seconds to respond to that argument. What happens then is you go back and forth across the until someone drops the ball. They could drop the ball by taking too long to respond, by repeating something they've already said, or just by being illogical or not taking an argument at its best, or by insulting the other side or something like that. That means the ball is dropped, they lose a point, and the other team really gains a point, and then you keep going a couple of rounds of that. You might change topic, and that can really teach individuals how to best deal with other people's arguments by giving them a lot of practice in an isolated environment. The second activity that we often use is called condensing smoke. This requires a little bit more preparation from the teacher. What the teacher does is they present an argument to the class, and it's not quite right in some way. It's structured poorly. It rambles. It doesn't really make logical sense. There's something wrong with it. And what the students then have to do, individually or in small groups, is they have to listen to the argument being made. Then they have to summarize the argument at its best form. So take the argument and engage with it at its best. And once they've done that, then they come up with 1, 2, 3 rebuttal points to it. And that's another great isolated activity that you can use in a classroom environment to help people really think about what the other person was trying to get across, understand what they were trying to do with it, and then actually respond to it. That then brings me to the third stakeholder in any debate, and that is the adjudicator. The adjudicator doesn't present arguments in the debate or participate necessarily in the to and fro in the debate. They're the person that both teams are trying to persuade. Importantly, in a debate, you're not actually trying to persuade the other team. The other team doesn't really matter in terms of the decision at the end. The person that you're trying to persuade is the adjudicator. And the adjudicator is a reasonable, independent person who is coming into the debate, not assuming any specialist knowledge, listening to what everyone has to say, and then coming to a decision on a comparison of both sides, which one they think is probably the right side of the topic. It's really important then, because that is the one person, or if it's a panel, maybe the 3 or 5 people that you are trying to persuade. And so, because that's the individual, or those are the individuals that you're trying to persuade, you really need to understand their perspective, really understand what motivates them, what is likely to persuade them, before, and empathize with where they come from or where they are coming from in order to properly persuade them that you should win that debate. And that is the thing that underlies the arguments and rebuttals that you make throughout. So a great example of this is a team I once knew who went through, in Australia, year 7 to 12 is the high school years, or in New South Wales, I should say. And they went through year 7 to 12 and they won the tournament every single year. And the way that they won it was, like, naturally they were all very talented and great debaters. But what they knew and what they put a lot of emphasis on was they knew most, if not all, of the adjudicators who looked after that competition. And so they knew when someone came in, oh, this is Bob. It was a religious competition. And so they knew that Bob was a religious man and that he responded really well to arguments about God and stuff like that. And so they'd reframe their arguments and reframe the debate to be around those ideas. Alternatively, they'd also often have other adjudicators who were mostly university students, and they tended to be much more atheist in the way they approached things. And so the reason and logic, and like cold, hard reason and cold, hard logic, was the thing that they responded best to. And so as a result, what you had was they would reframe their arguments to those adjudicators. And it was using that rather than going with what they thought was most persuasive, but instead going with what they thought the adjudicator would find most persuasive is the way that they won nearly every debate across 6 years of debating. So it's really important in a debate to know your audience. And when I say know your audience, you need to have empathy with your audience. You need to be empathetic with what do they like, what do they feel, what is likely to persuade them. So there are kind of two ways that you can go about doing this. The first one is an activity that we love to do in classroom environments, and it's a selling activity. So for younger years, what you'd do is you'd give them the opportunity to pick any product, and they would need to come up with the idea of how am I going to persuade the audience to buy this product. And so what you do is you have everyone kind of prepare like a poster, prepare a presentation for their product, and then they have to get up and persuade the audience to purchase that product. And then you might have a vote afterwards about an anonymous vote about who you would, which products people would be likely to buy. And that teaches empathy because individuals are no longer, the speakers are no longer thinking about, oh, what am I going to, why would I buy this? But why would my audience want to buy this as well? And so it teaches empathy in that way. You can also make it more interesting for older students and use the unsellable products type activity. And the unsellable products activity, instead, what you do is you get everyone to write down on usually a small piece of paper or put into a private messenger chat on the online classroom, something they think that couldn't be sold. So a jar full of air without its lid, a pair of sunglasses missing both lenses. And then what you do is you shuffle them all up, you hand them out, and then everyone needs to come up with a way of selling that product, empathizing with their particular audience and persuading them that their product's the one that they should buy. The other way that you can do it, and this is a more general teaching technique, is by actually putting students in an isolated environment into the adjudicator's shoes. So when a student gives a presentation in a class, you ask the students to give positive and importantly constructive, never negative feedback, always positive or constructive feedback on what they did well and what they could do to improve next time. That not only encourages active listening, which is really great for students anyway, but it also encourages them to be empathetic about how would I like to receive this type of feedback, or maybe as I'm now in the audience, I'm now getting a feel for what it's like when people watch me when I present. And so you can teach empathy in that way as well. One little bonus point then, now that I've gone through the 3 different stakeholders, is another final really important way that debating teaches empathy is the people that you actually debate about. So in debates for younger students, you often debate about their life experience. So for example, a very common topic that we have in Australia is that we should ban school uniforms. This is much easier for them to come up with ideas. They, at that age, haven't really developed a lot of abstract thought, don't do a whole lot of reading outside of their own life experience. Still, our brain is still very much developing, and so don't have a great grasp on life events. But as students become older, as they become more experienced, we move towards other topics that deal with important things that are happening across the world. Things like climate change, things like politics, things like minority rights, and stuff like that. And it moves away from things that relate specifically to the individual to things that are occurring in the world that they might not even really be all that aware about. So what does this do for students? It forces them to think about who is impacted by a topic. And that's really, really important. They need to think about who is impacted, what that impact is, and how big that impact will be for those individuals. It opens their eyes to the plight, the needs, the wants, and the desires of others who they wouldn't otherwise think about. So they need to really think outside the box, think outside of their own experience. And this not only encourages empathy, but it really forces empathy upon the students, because they need to not only understand the issues that these people are going through in order to make the argument. They need to actively go out there, formulate arguments, and try and persuade other people that these issues are really important. And this, because they need to provoke empathy in their adjudicator, in other people who are watching the debate, rather than just understanding it themselves. And that is really, really important. A really great way to teach this in isolation is what we call stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis involves taking any debating topic, and going, who is impacted by this topic? You then look at, so you create a list of all the individuals or groups or areas of society that are impacted by a topic. Then, once you've come up with that list, you look at the actual impacts. So you look at two utilitarian ideas. You look at how many people are in that group who are likely to be impacted, and you look at how big that impact is likely to be for those individuals. But then thirdly, you look at the specific vulnerabilities of individuals in that group. Are the individuals in that group able to fend for themselves? And if not, we probably have a moral duty as a society to protect them in some way. So people like children, the sick, the elderly, the disabled. And then you go through all of that. And that is actually a really important part of the preparation time that students have in a debate anyway. So it teaches a very strong, important debating skill, but it also teaches students to be empathic and empathetic towards other individuals in society they wouldn't have otherwise necessarily thought about or cared about. So that kind of brings me to the conclusion of the presentation. So back to the students I had in that debate in the story that I began with. It ended up being about something completely different. It ended up being about like university admissions and stuff like that. And so it didn't have very much to do about what we actually discussed in the class. But it was really good to see that, not that week, but a couple of weeks later, I saw them in another debate, and they were circumscribing their language. They were changing the way that they were expressing themselves because they were talking about like a disadvantaged stakeholder within another debate. And it made it clear to me that they walked away, and from debating, they have walked away learning a lot about empathy. Not just about how not to be offensive when you were talking to others, but also through the activity as a whole, through understanding the perspectives of others, by being put in shoes that they wouldn't have been put in, by thinking about individuals in society that they never would have come across otherwise. Debating is an amazing tool for helping students develop their empathy, and I really recommend its use in schools in Australia, but also very much all over the world. So thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.